The clink of fine silverware against bone china was a metronome of Richard Montgomery's life. It measured out his successes in sterile, precise ticks. He sat at the head of a table in the Gilded Leaf, a Manhattan restaurant where the walls were padded with silk and the conversations were as airless as the vacuum-sealed cuisine. Across from him, investors nodded, their eyes reflecting the cold fire of the crystal chandeliers above. They were there to hear about the next quarter, the next innovation, the next conquest of his data empire, Nexus. But Richard's attention was fractured. In the periphery of his vision sat his son, Lucas, a small, silent statue in a titanium wheelchair, 10 years old, and already his world had been reduced to the memory of his mother, Grace, and the suffocating silence that had followed her death. For 2 years, Lucas had retreated, a bird with folded wings. He was present, but he was not there. Across the room, Diana Johnson moved with a weary grace that the restaurant's patrons had long learned to ignore. Her server's uniform was a costume, a disguise for the woman who, by day, coaxed laughter and movement from children the world had deemed broken. Her feet ached. Her lower back throbbed a familiar rhythm, but her eyes, the color of warm earth, missed nothing. She saw Lucas, not the wheelchair, not the billionaire son, but the boy. His gaze was fixed on the jazz trio in the corner, a pianist, a bassist, a brush snare keeping a soft, swinging time. And then she saw it, the faint, almost imperceptible tap of his index finger against the armrest of his chair. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, a tiny, defiant pulse of life. She was refilling a water glass when his voice, small as a sparrow's, cut through the murmur. "Excuse me?" Richard paused his monologue about market saturation. The table turned. Lucas looked not at his father, but at Diana. Would you dance with me?" A snicker, quickly stifled, came from a woman in pearls. Richard's face tightened into a mask of polished annoyance. "Lucas, not now. This isn't the place." But Diana was already setting down the crystal pitcher. She saw the flicker of humiliation in the boy's eyes, the desperate, fleeting courage. She knelt, bringing her eyes level with his. The room held its breath. "It would be my honor," she said softly. She didn't try to lift him. She simply offered her hands. He placed his small, pale ones in hers. With a strength born not of gems but of lifting spirits, she supported his weight as he pushed himself up. His legs, weakened by grief and disuse, trembled violently. They were an awkward, beautiful sight. A waitress in a stained apron, and a boy in a tailored suit, swaying in a patch of carpet between tables. There was no grand waltz, just a shift of weight, a slow turn, her body a steady anchor for his unsteady ship. For a moment, the entire restaurant forgot about stock options and social strata. The clinking stopped. The whispers died. There was only the music, the movement, and a grace that had nothing to do with the name on the building. When the song ended, a smattering of applause started from a corner table. Lucas, breathless and flushed, sank back into his chair, a real, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in years. Richard's stone facade did not crack. He stood, his voice cold and precise. "Thank you for the performance. You may return to your duties." The dismissal was a physical blow, meant to reestablish the natural order of things. Diana met his gaze for a second, a silent challenge in her eyes, before nodding to Lucas and melting back into the staff corridor. That night, in the penthouse that overlooked the glittering, indifferent city, Richard tucked his son into bed. The silence between them was a familiar wall. "Dad." Lucas's voice was a sleepy whisper. "Yes, son?" She made me feel alive again. Richard stood in the darkness long after Lucas fell asleep. The words echoed in the sterile air, a haunting refrain. He looked at the city he commanded, the streams of data he controlled, and felt a profound, terrifying emptiness. He had built an empire, but he could not make his own son feel alive. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky, he picked up his phone, the decision settling in his gut like a stone. "Miriam," he said to his assistant, his voice rough with a sleepless night. "Find that woman." The Montgomery Tower was a needle piercing the belly of the clouds. On the 68th floor, Diana felt the vast, silent judgment of money. Her thrift store shoes were soundless on the marble, a stark contrast to the decisive clicks of the executives who passed her. She was shown into an office that was less a room and more a statement. Glass, steel, and a view designed to make visitors feel insignificant. Richard stood by the window, a silhouette against the sprawling map of his domain. He turned, and the morning light sharpened the lines of his face. "Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming." "You made it difficult to refuse," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He gestured to a chair worth more than her car. "What you did for Lucas was unexpected. It lifted his spirits. He's a wonderful boy. He's been through a lot." Richard leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "I'd like to make you an offer. A position. Lucas's emotional support companion. Full-time. $150,000 a year." The number hung in the air, immense and vulgar. Diana felt a hot flush of anger. Her pride, a thing she'd honed through countless struggles, reared up. She was a widow, a mother, a founder, not a paid friend. "You think you can buy what happened in that restaurant?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. Richard's eyebrow twitched. "I'm trying to reward it." "You can't buy connection, Mr. Montgomery." She stood, her 5'5" frame seeming to fill the space. "Your son doesn't need a companion. He needs a father." The words landed like a physical slap. No one, in over a decade, had spoken to him with such raw, unvarnished truth. He was too stunned to reply. Before he could form a retort, Diana reached into her bag and slid a folded flyer across the vast expanse of his desk. It was simple, printed on cheap paper. A stylized image of a child taking a dancing step, with the words, "Freedom Steps, empowering children with disabilities through movement and therapy. If you really want to help your son," she said, her tone softening from steel to something resembling pity, "come see what we do. No checkbook, just you." She left without another word, the silent whoosh of the office door her only farewell. Richard stared at the empty space where she had been. The audacity, the sheer, illogical pride of the woman. He snatched the flyer, crumpled it into a tight ball, and shot it perfectly into a wastebasket made of polished obsidian. Good riddance. But the workday passed, and the ball of paper seemed to pulse in his peripheral vision. That night, alone in his study, the silence was louder than ever. He saw Lucas's smile from the restaurant. He heard Diana's voice. "He needs a father." With a grunt of self-loathing, he walked to the wastebasket, retrieved the crumpled flyer, and carefully smoothed it out on his desk. The next afternoon, his Blacktown car pulled up to a converted church in the Bronx. The air here was different, thick with the sound of traffic, laughter, and life. He stepped out, absurdly overdressed in a $5,000 suit. And then he saw them. Children, running, falling, laughing. A boy with a prosthetic leg was kicking a soccer ball with a shriek of pure joy. It was chaos. It was beautiful. He stood frozen on the doorstep, a king at the gates of a republic that had no use for his crown. The scent of Freedom Steps was a unique blend of disinfectant, chalk, and joy. Richard stepped inside, his senses assaulted by the vibrant chaos. The stained glass windows of the old church now cast colored light on parallel bars and mats, not pews. It was the antithesis of a silent, ordered tower. Diana saw him first. She was in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, kneeling beside a little girl, helping her balance. She gave him a small, unsurprised nod. "You came." "I did." She introduced him to her co-founder, Dr. Elaine Mercer, a sharp-eyed woman with no-nonsense gray braid. Elaine's smile was thin and knowing. "Richard Montgomery. We've never met, but I pitched a project to Nexus a few years back, a movement-based neural therapy program for children with spinal injuries." Richard had a vague memory of a report. "Not scalable," he'd scribbled in the margin. "You rejected it." Elaine said, not unkindly, "Guess God scaled it for us." The remark landed with perfect precision. Richard was still reeling when he saw Lucas, hovering near the wall, his face a mask of embarrassment. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Before Richard could formally reply, a boy about Lucas's age, with a shock of black hair and one prosthetic leg, zipped past on blade-like running feet. "Come on, Lucas. You can do it." Diana knelt before Lucas. "Miguel's right. You're stronger than you think. Just to the parallel bars. I'll be right with you." Lucas glanced at his father, then back at Diana's unwavering belief. He nodded, A tiny, determined movement. With immense effort, he pushed himself up, gripping the bars. His knuckles were white, his entire body shaking. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted to rush over, to help, to stop this painful spectacle. But he didn't. He watched. One trembling step, then another. Diana was a quiet presence beside him, her hands ready but not touching. Halfway down the bars, Lucas's legs buckled. Diana's arms were there in an instant, not to carry him, but to steady him. "I can't." Lucas gasped, tears of frustration in his eyes. "You already are," Diana whispered. He took another step, and then, for a single, breathtaking second, he let go of the right bar and reached for the left, taking one completely unaided, freestanding step before grabbing on again. It was a miracle, a tiny, seismic miracle in a converted church in the Bronx. Richard Montgomery, the billionaire who built an empire on not showing emotion, felt a hot tear escape and trace a path down his cheek. He was too stunned to wipe it away. He had spent a fortune on the best doctors, the best equipment. And it was here, in this place of frayed edges and fierce love, that his son had chosen to walk again. The themes of his life, class, control, power, shattered and fell away, leaving only the raw, human truth of compassion and the dawning, terrifying rediscovery of fatherhood. As he stood there, humbled and awestruck, a reporter who had been doing a feature on the center raised her camera. The shutter clicked, capturing the perfect, poignant image, the mighty Richard Montgomery, with tears in his eyes, watching his son learn to walk. The next morning, that photo was on the front page of the New York Post. The headline was a sledgehammer. "Broken Billionaire. Tech Titan humbled at Bronx Rehab Center." The silence in Richard's boardroom was more aggressive than any shouted accusation. On the massive media screen, the New York Post headline, "Broken Billionaire," glowed like a brand. His PR team, a flock of anxious suits, chirped about damage control, narrative reclamation, and shareholder anxiety. "The optics are a disaster," Richard said as head of communications. "They're painting you as vulnerable. The market hates vulnerability." Richard stared out at the city, but he no longer saw his kingdom. He saw a converted church in the Bronx. He wasn't furious at the press, but at the hollow man in the photograph, the man who needed a public shaming to rediscover his own son. Meanwhile, at Freedom Steps, the phone was ringing off the hook. The viral story had unleashed a tidal wave of attention. Donations poured in from small-dollar donors, moved by the image. Parents from across the country called, their voices thick with desperate hope, begging for a spot for their children. Diana and Elaine were drowning. Their systems were overwhelmed. Their space was inadequate, and their humble staff was buckling under the administrative load. In a moment of quiet chaos, surrounded by unpacked medical supplies and stacks of unprocessed mail, Diana found herself on the phone with Richard. It was supposed to be a curt update. Instead, her composure cracked. "We're drowning in success," she confessed, her voice frayed at the edges. "We can't help everyone who's asking. We're turning children away because we don't have the room, the hands." Something in her tone, the sound of a strong woman on the verge of breaking, severed the last of Richard's corporate instincts. He didn't offer a check. He offered his mind. Quietly, without fanfare, he began to help. He didn't come in a suit. He came in jeans and a worn-out shirt, startling the staff. He used his genius for logistics to streamline the donation process. He leveraged his network to source building materials at cost for a new wing. He sat on the floor with spreadsheets, his brow furrowed not over billion-dollar mergers, but over the cost of pediatric parallel bars. During these visits, a new ritual was born. He would work, and then he would watch Lucas. He saw his son's confidence bloom under Diana's gentle guidance and the rough-and-tumble friendship of Miguel. The boy who once hid in silence was now laughing, arguing about video games, taking more steps each day. One night, back in the penthouse, Richard was helping Lucas into bed, a task he'd once delegated to nurses. He straightened the covers, his movements awkward but tender. "Lucas," he began, the words foreign on his tongue, but feeling more right than any business directive ever had. I'm proud of you." Lucas smiled, a sleepy, peaceful smile. "I know, Dad." He snuggled into his pillow. "Diana told me you'd say it one day." The word stole the air from Richard's lungs. Diana's compassion wasn't just for Lucas. It had been quietly, patiently, building a bridge for him. 2, assuring his son that the father was still there, waiting to be found. But in the shadows, his rival, Julian Croft, a former partner he'd ruthlessly outmaneuvered years ago, watched the proceedings with a predator's smile. He saw Richard's vulnerability not as a weakness, but as a weapon. He obtained internal emails showing Richard's initial transactional offer to Diana and his subsequent secretive involvement with Freedom Steps. The leak was a masterstroke of malice. A whistleblower report, fueled by Julian Croft, hit the financial press. It accused Richard of a cynical, calculated PR stunt, using a vulnerable community and a struggling nonprofit to rehabilitate his image after his son's tragedy. The narrative flipped overnight. Montgomery's charity charade, exploiting the disabled for profit. The media, fickle as ever, turned. Diana was painted as a naive pawn, Elaine a sellout scientist. The major donors, the ones Richard's team had just reassured, pulled their funding en masse. Freedom Steps was now facing collapse, its reputation tarnished by the very attention that had once saved it. The board of Nexus demanded his resignation. The pressure was immense, a torrent of outrage and schadenfreude. Richard could have fought. He could have exposed Julian, dragged the truth into the light through a messy public war. But he looked at the photo of Lucas taking his first step, and he knew that to fight that war would be to drag Freedom Steps and his son back into the mud. It was the old Richard's game. He called a press conference. In a stunning move, he stepped down as CEO of Nexus, accepting full responsibility for the distraction and the misinterpretation of his actions, never once naming Julian as the source. But the true crucible was the Senate hearing on the misuse of charitable funds, called by a grandstanding politician. In a wood-paneled room, under the glare of C-SPAN cameras, Richard was grilled for hours. He was calm, contrite, and utterly resolute. Then came the question from a sneering senator. "Mr. Montgomery, can you finally admit that this entire endeavor was a costly and failed attempt to burnish your personal brand?" Richard looked up, his gaze finding the camera, hoping somehow that Lucas and Diana were watching. His voice was low but clear, echoing in the silent chamber. "Senator, for most of my life, I measured success in market share and net worth. I was a brilliant businessman and a failure of a man. Then I walked into a place called Freedom Steps, and I saw my son walk for the first time in years." He paused, the memory softening his face. "If doing the right thing, if trying, however clumsily, to become a better father, cost me everything I built, then for the first time in my life, I finally invested wisely." In the living room of their small apartment, Lucas watched the broadcast, Diana's arm around his shoulders. As his father spoke, Lucas whispered to Diana, his eyes shining. He finally walked. The public, witnessing this raw, unscripted humility, began to turn. The narrative shifted again, this time to one of redemption. But it was too late for Richard's old life. Having spoken his truth, he granted one final, quiet interview and then, seemingly, vanished in the public eye completely. 1 year later, the air in Washington, D.C. was thick with spring and a sense of profound accomplishment. The Freedom Steps National Center for Children was a stunning, state-of-the-art facility, designed not as a hospital, but as a palace of possibility. It buzzed with the same joyful chaos as its Bronx predecessor, but on a scale that could meet the overwhelming need. Diana, now the center's full-time director, moved through the crowds with a calm authority. Dr. Elaine Mercer oversaw a world-class research wing, her once dismissed theories now changing lives on a national scale. The opening ceremony was held in the sun-drenched main courtyard. The keynote speaker was not a politician or celebrity, but a confident 11-year-old boy who walked, unaided, to the podium, his gait slightly unsteady but radiant with pride. "My name is Lucas Montgomery," he began, his voice clear and strong. "A couple of years ago, I was in a wheelchair, not just because I couldn't walk, but because I didn't want to. I thought my story was over. But a woman taught me that broken steps still lead somewhere. And a man My dad taught me that it's never too late to learn how to walk again. As he finished, a wave of emotional applause filled the courtyard, and then a soft, steady clapping rose from the back of the crowd. People turned, parting to reveal a man they barely recognized. Richard. He was older, his hair more gray than black, his famous suit replaced by a simple, comfortable sweater. The hard, hungry look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound and settled peace. He walked to Diana, who watched him with a knowing, tear-filled smile. "You built all this," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We built it," she corrected softly. He shook his head, looking at the mural on the entrance wall. A beautiful rendering of the viral photo of him and Lucas, his hand on his son's shoulder. "I came to your doorstep to build my son a future," he said. "Turns out you built me one instead." Diana reached out and took his hand, a simple, human gesture of forgiveness and shared victory. Freedom isn't what we give others, Richard. It's what we find when we finally let go. As the celebration continued around them, the camera of our mind would pull back, panning out over the courtyard. Children ran and danced, their prosthetic limbs and adaptive devices gleaming in the sunlight, not as symbols of limitation, but of liberation. And on the wall, just beside the mural, a simple bronze plaque caught the light. It read, "Dedicated to those who dare to believe that broken steps still lead somewhere." The legacy was not a building or a foundation or a fortune. It was the echo of a dance in a quiet restaurant, the sound of father's proud whisper and the countless, unsteady, beautiful steps that followed.